Welcome to Ceasefire, where civics meets civility and engagement meets empowerment. Ceasefire is hosted by former Boerne ISD trustee and owner of the Boerne Bookshop, Dale Adams, and by former Boerne City Council member and local insurance agent, Ron Cisneros.
Welcome to Ceasefire. My name is Dale Adams.
And I'm Ron Cisneros.
And we're brought to you by the Boerne Bookshop. And today we are going to talk about term lengths, term limits, all those things about how long people stay in office once you do elect them. What you got for us, Ron?
We're going to start off with term limits. I think that if we polled, most Americans would favor term limits. We're so used to the idea of people running for Congress or running for Senate, and they stay in there for years. And nobody likes that. Nobody thinks it's a good idea, and that we can't seem to get rid of it. And there are some people that say we don't need a law. We certainly don't want these people lingering in there, but we don't need a law to change that. That's what voting is for. But
Yes.
has that worked?
Not always. And I used to always be of the belief that we shouldn't have term limits. And philosophically, I do believe that, because I do think people should be able to make their own decisions. But I do think, like you're saying, is people stay in there forever and ever. And I think as the office goes higher and higher, there's more and more of a disconnect between the voters and the elected person. And so I have come over to believe that higher office should have term limits. Lower office, local level, maybe not so much, because it's a lot easier to throw the bums out. Whereas in higher office, incumbency has so much clout that maybe we just need to set some rules down.
Like you, I, for years, was in the we don't need term limits camp.
Yeah.
I thought that we could, every 2 years, throw out a member of Congress if we didn't like them, and every 6 years, throw out our senator.
Rarely happens.
Yeah, I am 56 now, and that just doesn't happen. That's not the reality. To prepare for the show, I was curious about the average length of a stay of a congressman, and I couldn't get that information. I was trying to figure out when you get elected to Congress, how long do you stay there? Mm-hmm. But I found some other information that was just really eye-opening and has really solidified me in the camp of we need term limits. So check this out. On average, incumbents can raise 5 times as much money as their challengers. And special interests contribute between 85 to 95% of their PAC dollars on average to incumbents, not challengers.
Yeah.
So the longer you stay there, the harder it is for you to get unseated. Mm-hmm. Right? And you stop listening to your constituents.
Because they're not paying you.
They're not paying you.
Yeah.
Somebody else is. Right?
Yeah.
And those people have a vested interest in keeping you there, even if they don't agree with you on, let's say, social issues. Mm-hmm. You're greasing their skids.
Money talks.
Yeah.
And sometimes its voice is a lot louder than the voters.
Yeah. And so for that reason, and for reasons of just wanting to refresh the government and get out of these cycles where it's the same voices you hear over and over again, I've moved over to the other camp. What's the old saying about diapers and politicians should be changed often for the same reason?
And one of the foundations of our government and our country actually is the frequent transition of power. We have 4-year presidential terms, and the whole purpose of that was so that we wouldn't have somebody who would be our leader forever, and then we'd have violent change. So by having small changes every few years has helped our country be free. And I think the same thing that applies to the leadership also applies to the legislature. And it needs turnover. And we're not getting it, honestly.
On our President's Day show that we did a few weeks back, you had talked about George Washington as one of your favorite presidents because he had the ability to stay indefinitely. He was much beloved, and he could have ran for 3, 4, 5 terms, but he didn't. And it made me think as we were coming into this show that if the first president of the United States said 2 terms is enough, and many presidents after that decided the same thing, and because it wasn't law until after Roosevelt died, why is it that those men who had a lot of great power could walk away, but we can't walk away from a House position or a Senate position?
Yeah.
No.
the quest and the taste for power can be overwhelming, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you have it, it's so hard to let go. It's
Mm-hmm.
just you breathe it and you live it, and you've got to have it. And so the biggest blame, I guess, I would put in us, not as a society, not saying, okay, you've done your time to move on. We need to have more variety in our representation. Some people, an argument a lot of people have used is that you want the best people there. Not necessarily. And honestly, we've got 350 million people here. There's probably about a dozen at least that would be good enough for that one position at any given time.
Yeah.
That person is not going to be the best person for the job. There's lots of options.
There was an interesting article in the National Review shortly after November's election, and it was about members of the House and Senate that had been there for decades. And I don't want to get into the names of them. I know there were people that would say, those aren't really our best and brightest. How are they still there? And take our past president who had 50 years from, I forget where he started, but then he was obviously in the Senate for a long time. I think he had started as a city councilman or somewhere in there, and then ran for Senate and was there forever. Then he was vice president, then he was president. And while there were different positions, the Senate term was forever and a day. How much time does somebody need to spend in government?
5-10 years. I think that's about it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that a lot of people assume is that experience makes you better at something. Now, in some cases it does. If you're a carpenter, sometimes if you're a salesman or any kind of skill-based thing, it makes you better. Politics is different, in my view. Now, experience may make you better at the back and forth discussions and compromises, but I don't think experience in politics makes your values better.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we get mixed up, is we think, okay, the good people are the ones with the good values, but your values aren't increased by being in politics. Politics is a corroding influence, and so your values are worsened by your exposure to that. And some people may have questioned that, but I don't. And honestly, I think we need fresh faces because we need renewed values in positions of leadership.
And I think we call it public service, right? After a certain amount of time, it's no longer public service.
Yeah.
It's private service, right? And again, I'm going to refrain from going into names because I don't want this to be a Republican versus Democrat or other way around. But there are people that if I gave you their name, we could go back and we could look at them pre-office, and their net wealth is one number, right? And then after many decades of service, they're millionaires. Congressmen make $170-something thousand a year. I don't remember the exact number. And yet there are people who've only been there 6 years, and their net worth is in the millions now.
Yeah.
Like, how does that happen?
So something interesting, in 2024, I'll throw a name out here just because everybody's heard of it, but not because I'm trying to pick on her too much. Nancy Pelosi, her experience has given her an incredible ability to invest.
Mm-hmm.
Her investment portfolio grew at a 70+% rate last year. It has over the last dozens of years. And she's not even in the top 10. We've got congressmen and Republicans, I think the top one's a Republican, with investment returns of 150% in a year.
Mm-hmm.
So they are getting wealthy somehow, and they're cloaking it in investment. And so it's become a means of making money rather than serving your country.
Right.
And one of the big things the founders were really against was paying anything to elected leaders. They didn't want them to be paid anything, or just a nominal amount to feed them while they're there. And I honestly think that's the way it should be. I don't think we should pay our elected leaders anything beyond maybe enough to pay for the paper that they have to write on. And they could even donate that. I mean, I have some volunteer organizations I'm in, and when we need something, I just go out and buy it. I'm not asking for compensation for that because I figure that's part of my donation to this position that I'm in.
Right.
And I expect that out of them too. And honestly, I want somebody who's been successful in life and can show it to be my leader.
Yeah. So there's an argument that it costs money to be a congressman, right? You go up to Washington, you have to spend time there, rent's expensive, the cost of living's expensive, and the $170,000+ a year that they make is insufficient to cover their expenses in D.C. What do you say to that?
I would say two things. One is the cost of living up there is expensive because we pay them money. If you look at college tuition, it went up when the government started giving money to all the students. So the colleges just raised it. So the costs are based on the incomes there. Second of all, I want somebody who's successful to go to Washington. I want somebody who can afford to go there and spend a lot of money on themselves and have to live there. And if they can't, then they should room. There are congressmen that have roommates. A lot of the freshmen don't live in some big fancy house. And I don't think any of them need to.
Yep.
I don't have any sympathy for the need for congressmen of any sort getting any kind of pay.
I don't as well, and I would add that I've always thought that if that truly was a concern, it could be solved readily with dormitories.
Yes. Let's put them all in an orphanage up there.
Yeah. There is a story I was reading recently of a building in D.C. that is now up for sale. It was owned by the U.S. government, and it had a 3% occupancy rate. 3%. And it was costing millions of dollars every year for the upkeep and maintenance of that building. But D.C. doesn't let go of anything. And they're finally going to sell this. And I thought, heck, just convert that to dormitories.
Yeah.
And put all these so-called struggling congressmen in there, since it's so terrible to live in D.C., so terribly expensive. Great. Here's a dormitory for you. It's got a little burner so that you can heat up some leftovers in a coffee pot. It's got a single bed, so if you do bring a mistress over, it's going to be very uncomfortable for you. We didn't send you up there to go have relations anyway. You're going to live honestly and very minimally. They don't need you living better than we do, and that's what they're doing.
And that ties in with the laws we live under, too.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to get back to term limits after a quick break. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron, brought to you by the Boerne Bookshop, and we'll be back in just a moment to talk about term lengths. Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop. We pride ourselves on finding what you're looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop. Welcome back. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron, and we went in a tangent there with compensation for elected officials, but now we're going to go back and we're going to talk about the lengths of terms of elected office.
Yeah, and I'm going to make this one a local discussion because in a few weeks, if you're living inside the corporate city limits of the city of Boerne, you're going to be asked to consider extending the length of term for a councilman. Right now, it's 2 years. And this subject has come up before. The last time the city had a charter election to amend their charter, there were, I think, 14 amendments to consider, one of which was to extend the term from 2 to 3 year terms. Of those 14, 13 were approved, but the voters overwhelmingly decided that 2 years was a sufficient amount of time for a councilman. And I'm here to say that I agree with that. Now, I'm going to present to you the argument that council makes for amending the charter and extending their terms. And the argument, very simply, is this. You run for office, and you get in, you're a newly elected councilman, and as soon as you're sworn in, within 2 weeks, you're tackling the budget. And the budget is extraordinary. I forget what it is now, 100 and something million. Let me say this, that staff is tackling the budget, and they bring you these different versions of it. You'll see the first draft, and then you might see the third draft, and then you might see the seventh draft. And you're deciding as a council member what is going to be funded and what's not going to be funded. It is an arduous process, and for a freshman, it can be pretty tough.
Can I interject?
Sure.
Before you go on to the next topic, there is a solution to that.
What's that?
If we had local elections in November, they'd have quite a bit of time to get up to speed.
Oh, yeah.
But local elections are in May, specifically for the purpose of decreased turnout.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm
brought it
glad
on
you brought
yourself.
that up, because I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. The numbers are always shocking when I share this with people. And another solution is that the person running for office can familiarize themselves with the budget. It's all online.
right, you can do
before
it
they
ahead of
run
time.
for office.
Yeah.
So the argument, again, for extended terms is that you dive into this budget process, and then you're drinking from that proverbial fire hose. And then within a few months, and it's really 2 years, but it seems like a matter of months, you're running for office again. So let's talk about that, because I do agree that time passes quickly when you're sitting in that seat, much like your childhood passes quickly. It doesn't while you're in it, but it does pass quickly. First off, the council campaigns, you can start to file for office on January 15th. And then May 7th, we've got an election. This is not a long campaign season. It's not this brutal, stretched out run for Congress. This is a very short window. There's no primary. So the idea that a councilman is dealing with the budget and then they're drinking from that fire hose and now they're back into the election process, that's a bunch of fantasy baloney. I just don't accept that. Look, I was on council for 4 terms. Once you go through that first experience, you've done that. Right. And so if you're an incumbent, it gets easier each subsequent election. Right. So this idea that I need to help an incumbent because, oh, my gosh, I just ran. No, that was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
You got to do it again. And it works for the U.S. House. It works for the state House, which, by the way, only meets every other year. And you're telling me that the running of the city of Boerne is more difficult than the running of the United States? I don't think so. Yeah. And here's the other thing. If you run for Congress, you've got, whenever somebody steps down, like when we saw Lamar Smith step down, and there was 20-something, I forget, people running for that seat. You don't see that in a city council election. So you're not out there fighting 20 other people that want to be councilmen. Most of the time, they're not even running against anybody. Nobody wants that position. Yeah. And then the number of people that actually turn out to vote, who do you have to impress? In the last mayoral election, there were exactly 2,076 people that voted for the mayor's seat. Right? Now,
That's 10%.
Yeah.
Wow.
Let's talk about the city council position that was up 2 years ago. And this was for District 2, the only one where there was any competition. And 483 people decided that election. Now, these numbers, the mayoral election 2 years ago, those numbers were a little high. Because usually it's 1,400 to 1,500, but we had a very popular candidate. Yeah. For the council position, 400 is about on par. So the argument that you're a freshman councilman and now you've got to run for re-election and it's a giant struggle. No, it's not a giant struggle. You got to go out and talk to the 400 likely voters that are going to vote. That is not an epic struggle.
And that keeps you in touch with your base.
That's right.
With the people. Yeah.
And I want them to do that.
Yeah.
You know? I don't see any good that comes from a 3-year term except for the incumbent. They get another year. Yeah. And just not, as we talked about with term limits. But honestly, being completely honest, I think I was better in my first 2 terms than I was in my 4th term.
Oh, yeah.
I think I was jaded in my 4th term.
That does happen, yeah. Speaking from my experience, being on the school board, we had 3-year terms. Mm-hmm. And it was nice, I'll admit. I didn't have to run very often. I only ran twice, lost once, ran again. And then the second time, I didn't have an opponent, so I didn't have to run. It is nice to not have to worry about that. But it also means that we had slower turnover of people on the board than you guys had on the council. I can't speak from knowing about 2-year terms because I've never been in one. But honestly, I don't feel that is such a hardship to be on a 2-year term because it does keep you in touch with your constituents, especially since it's precincts or it's districts. Right. And they aren't that big. And so going out there and meeting several hundred of your constituents on a regular basis is a good thing. But I'll admit, as a person who had a 3-year term, I did like that. Yeah. Look, no doubt it'll make your life easier as a candidate. Yeah, it does.
But I don't think that is your role. The role
not?
is not for, yeah.
Oh, come on.
Yeah,
My life needs to be easy.
Yeah, as voters, we're not there to make your life easier. In fact, we make your life complicated. It's supposed to be that way. You're supposed to represent us, and I'm sorry if you don't think 2 years is enough time to do that. It really is. Ultimately, if this amendment passes, I don't think it's the end of the world. Right. But I do think it makes it harder for us to get rid of bad representation, because now we've got to wait an extra year to get rid of a bad council member.
Yeah. But I feel also that maybe part of the purpose is that there's concern, there's always concern about the squeaky wheels, the loud people coming out and wanting to overwhelm and replace people. You can call them special interests, you can call them nosy neighbors, you can call them whatever you want, but that is one of the concerns, I think, about people in office, is having to deal with being targeted for removal. And I think there's a little bit of that in here, because this having 3 years does spread out the elections to be 2, 2, and 2 instead of 3 and 2 all the time, or however it is.
Yeah. There are safeguards in place, though, that I think minimize the impact of those squeaky wheels. So there are people out there that, for whatever reason, are always upset, and so they'll bring in a challenger, and if that challenger succeeds, they will soon turn on that challenger once that challenger becomes the incumbent. And I've seen this play out several times. But everybody comes in equally ignorant. So if...
Not me.
Not you? Well, and I appreciate that, actually, because I spent a lot of time myself trying to prepare myself for that role. I basically went to council meetings for 2 years before I ever got elected to try and familiarize myself with that. And even then, I was still overwhelmed with the enormity of the budget at that time, which was probably half of what it is today. But if somebody comes in, and let me take this from the perspective of staff, they'll tell you that if 3 council members get unseated and 3 new ones come in, then they have to take time to train them. That's not your job.
Right.
The qualifications to be a councilman are that you're a resident of the city for 6 months, you're 21 years of age at the time that you're sworn into office. So you don't even have to be 21 to run, right? And that's it. And for mayor, it's 12 months of residency and at least 21 by the time you take office. And that's it. That's built into our charter. Yeah. That's the only requirement. And then there are people like the city manager and the city attorney who will keep you in line if you do anything afoul of the charter. If you're completely ignorant and you're not doing what you're supposed to do, or you're proposing legislation that's illegal, that's where the city attorney steps in and says, you can't do that. It might be that the city needs 3 fresh faces or 2 fresh faces. Yeah.
There's a lot of guardrails.
Yes.
There's a lot of guidance that's built in, not necessarily training from the staff, but built in the structure of the government that prevents new people from coming in and just waylaying away and changing things in bad ways. Yeah.
Speaking of guardrails, so you've got an excellent book recommendation for us.
Okay, so I didn't have any books on term limits. I've got one that anybody that knows Jack Ryan out there, lots of movies, lots of shows and stuff going on. Started by an author called Tom Clancy, really good author. And the first Jack Ryan novel was The Hunt for Red October, which also was an awesome movie.
Yes.
And we've got that one in the store. And if you want to get started on reading about Jack Ryan, that's a great book.
Yep.
Great book to start with.
Hey, folks, if you like what you hear on the show and you want to get some more of it, Dale and I would like to invite you to Whiskey and Wisdom, a new book club that started late last year, and we meet every other month.
And that would be the 3rd Thursday of April, June, August, October, and December.
Please join us. We're going to have an assortment of whiskeys there and a great conversation about a very interesting book. Hope to see you there.
And that will be it for today. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. If you missed anything, you can always go to BoerneRadio.com and listen to our podcast. And we will see you next week. Thanks for listening. Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you're looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop.